Hi everyone, and thanks for joining us today. Today we're going to be talking you through a practical guide for implementing effective BI governance. I'm Mike Smitherman over here at Metric Insights, and I also have Marius Moscovici with us, who's our founder and CEO. Hi Marius.
Hello.
So we're going to be walking you through sort of a toolbook for governance and implementing effective governance, and then show you some technology examples of how you might implement that. As we go through this, please feel free to enter questions in the Q&A window, and we'll address those as we go through it. And obviously, this is also being recorded up on BrightTalk, so you can access the recording afterwards. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Marius, who's going to take us through the first piece.
Thank you, Mike. So we're going to go through a quick just intro definition of BI governance, but I want to tell you that just generally in this webinar, one of our goals is to really give you a very specific and practical set of tools that you can take away. So whatever technology you're using for your governance, hopefully you'll be able to walk away with some very specific things that you can go and apply in your environment to help really right size the governance process and make sure that it's effective. So first though, let's just talk about what BI governance is briefly, because oftentimes there's confusion and people just think when they hear BI governance, they just think about data governance. And of course, governing your data is very important, but it is only one part of the governance puzzle. You need to think about both data and analytics together in order to come up with a comprehensive and effective governance solution. And it's almost self-evident as to why that is, because if you've done a fantastic job of governing your data, you've got high data quality, you've got lineage, people know and are using the correct data. If they then apply it through analytics that are not properly governed and different business rules are applied across that data, when it's being pulled in, it's being represented in different ways, different definitions are applicable, then all that work that you've done with effective data governance is for naught, because the end user is not seeing a fully governed solution. So we're going to focus today a little bit on the data side, but probably more heavily we're going to talk a lot about what you need to do on an analytics governance perspective, because that's the part where it often is overlooked and causes many issues for people in the industry. So thinking about BI governance, kind of going to the next level, there are three pieces that you need to consider. And I like to think of, if you think about BI governance as your kind of a well-oiled machine, if it's running effectively, then there are three gears within this machine that have to turn in unison. You have to fit well together and just kind of turn together so that you can get the outcome that you want. And those three are people. You need to obviously have the right team there of folks that are going to be doing these governance functions with clearly defined roles and responsibilities. So that's very important. Can't really get out of the starting gate without that. But then equally important, you need a process that is well aligned with those people. So a process they follow for governance that really works, that they're bought into, that they can apply consistently. And then with that process, you need technology. You need some way to enable that process to be repeated and to be done without a huge amount of difficult effort that's going to dissuade people from adhering to your governance methodology. So when you have all three of these moving together in concerts, kind of like gears, like cogs in a machine, then you generate effective governance. So let's drill down a little deeper into each of these. So on the people side, there are three roles that we find are critically important for governance to work. The first one is the business owner. So this is, obviously, it's clearly important that you have proper business rule definitions. If you haven't defined the thing that you're going to be analyzing and displaying to the user in a consistent way, then the number is meaningless. Business owner's role is to define what that means. What does it mean to have what is gross sales? What is net churn? What are those things, and how do we kind of measure that in a way that is consistent and agreeable so that everyone understands what that terminology is? A second key role is that of the BI analyst. This is the person who's building the visualization, and they're responsible for taking that business logic, that rule those rules that have been defined by the business and agreed upon, and then applying that to the visualizations in a consistent way. So if I'm the analyst building something with Tableau dashboard off of sales reporting, and there's a certain rules about how territories are supposed to work, I need to make sure that territory alignment logic is in fact instantiated in my visualization in a way that's consistent with what the business has dictated. And then finally, there is the role of the data steward. So this individual is largely responsible around with data here. Now here they're responsible for making sure that the data is right. So both from a quality perspective, how do we know that the data that's included in a particular visualization is free from major defects? But also, is the right data being used in this visualization? Are we sourcing from what should be the system of truth? Are we using, the proper applied paradigm in getting that information? So that's the data steward's responsibility. And all three roles together, working in concert, will generate high quality governance. So let's look at an example, because we said we're going to be very practical in the approach here. So let's imagine for a moment that you have a sales operations use case, right? You've got a dashboard that is going to measure sales performance by territory for different reps. They're going to look at it and they're going to understand how they're performing. So in this example, the business rule definitions might be defined by the sales ops team, where they say, well, here's what the attainment calculation, the way that we measure performance for these particular reps, includes the following rules. Here's what counts towards their quota. Here's what doesn't. Here's when the quota gets reset. Here's when various multipliers come in that are used to compute their compensation. All that is defined by usually the sales ops team together with the VP of sales and so forth, right? So that's the business rule definitions. The business analyst does that. Then the analyst will come in and they will make sure that those rules that have been devised are integrated into that dashboard, that the right charts and tables are created using that information. It's all been consistently applied, and that the dashboard design as a whole, conforms to those rules in terms of how the data is presented. And then finally, the data steward might be responsible for ensuring that, yes, this information is actually being pulled in from the right source. Maybe it needs to come from Salesforce directly, or perhaps it needs to be coming from a data warehouse where that Salesforce data has flowed through the proper data quality checks, that it's been cleaned and transformed, and the right business rules have been applied so that the data is consistent and ready for visualization. And so you can see kind of in this example how these three roles kind of work together to make this solution happen. And I listed them as individuals, but of course these roles could be conceivably mapped to a single physical person, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But before we do that, I want to talk about the process side, right? So we've kind of talked about the people. So now that second cog, there's an issue that we've seen, kind of an error, a mistake rather, that people make time and time again when it comes to governance, and it comes out of this sort of situation that plays itself out. You think about, okay, I want to institute governance. Well, there are two competing forces here. You've got, on the one hand, you want to put rigorous process in place because you want to make sure that you're adhering to all compliance issues and things are well governed. On the other hand, you've got this conflicting issue because people just don't like to spend a lot of time on governance. It's not a high glory, high fun type of activity, and so you want to come up with processes that are as lightweight as possible, so that you're going to maximize your chances that people are going to comply with them. And these competing forces, push up against each other, and rational people say, well, why don't we split the difference? Why don't we kind of, go in the middle and come up with something that kind of balances the need for rigor with the need for an easy, simple process that people can follow without a lot of time. And this seems reasonable, but in fact, it's a huge mistake. And to give you an illustration why that is, imagine for a moment that instead of doing governance of data, you were opening up a men's clothing store, and you say, I know that men do not like to shop, right? At least I don't, and they don't like to spend a lot of time in the store. So we're going to make it really easy for them when they come in. We're going to do away with the whole fitting process because that's very time consuming. We're just going to take the average suit, the average size from the shelf, and that's what we're going to give them. Everyone's going to get the average size. Well, that's ludicrous, right? All of your customers are going to walk out looking like this gentleman over here, maybe with the exception of one or two that happen to have to meet that average size, and you're going to be very quickly out of business. And yet, this thing that seems clearly wrong from a when you think about it in a perspective of fitting people to suits is what we do with governance all the time. Is we come up with processes that are kind of the average of what might be possible, and then we implement it, and it doesn't fit most of the content that's being managed. So the overriding principle, the thing I want to convey in the methodology we're going to show you, the thing that drives that is the notion of right-sizing your BI governance. So applying the right level of process that's relevant to the content that is being governed. Let's talk about that and what does that really mean in detail. So to do this, you just basically need to think about your content that's being governed across two different dimensions. On the vertical dimension here, imagine that you're looking at classification around business impact. So you've got a dashboard or report or something that you want to govern. Does it have a low, medium, or high impact on the organization? And the way to think about that is if something were to go wrong, let's say there's an error in the data, how big of a deal would it be? And that's one way to classify that impact. A second dimension is to think about it from an audience size perspective. So how many people are going to consume this particular analytic? Is it just going to one or two or a small group of people? Is it going to the entire enterprise or something in between? Right? So small, medium, large on that. And then see where your content lands. Right? And based on that, you would then figure out how much of a process is involved. Is it a single individual that needs to be involved in the publishing certification, or is it multiple parties? So, for example, let's say you have something that is going to have a low business impact and only it needs to be consumed by a small group of people. That would be the kind of content that a BI analyst would be responsible for publishing and certifying on their own. You don't need those other roles explicitly managed by other people because that analyst can be responsible for the definition and the rules and making sure that the data quality is good. On the other hand, if you've got something that maybe has medium business impact and goes to a significant size audience, well, there it probably makes sense to involve a business owner as well because the cost of making a mistake there is quite high as compared to the other scenarios. So having a little bit more process really is a good fit there. So there, the business owner should be involved as well in the process. And then, of course, if you have something with very large impact, it's going to thousands of people and has potentially very high business impact, then that is a place where getting the data steward involved makes sense too, because you've got to really be triply sure that there are no issues with the information that goes out. It's got to be 100% correct 100% of the time. And then you can imagine on your own, you can fill out this grid for the rest of the content based on again the audience size and the business impact, and determine how lightweight or heavyweight of a process really makes sense as far as the number of personas that need to be involved. Now, certification, the publishing of content and certification, to do it correctly, to be effective, it cannot be a one and done type operation, right? Just because something is certified, it's been checked, it's been vetted. Well, over time, there's going to be some drift. The content you created that was useful 6 months ago, well, now maybe is not relevant today. Maybe a business rule has changed. Maybe something has changed in the underlying data. It needs to be reevaluated. So all certified content should go through a recertification type of process. And that is based on one or two types of triggers. Either it's going to be based on elapsed time. Here's a new report. I'm going to revisit this in 6 months or in a year or in 2 years, and I'm going to determine if it's still relevant, if it's still accurate, and should it still carry that certification mantle. Or it's based on a calendar. This is a financial report. Every month, at the beginning of the month, we do our financial close. So we're going to decertify on the first of every month, and then it's going to get recertified during the subsequent days as we close the books and validate the data. So those are the two kind of triggers. And then from a process perspective, there are two things you might want to do. So you might want to either automatically decertify. So in that financials example, right, I'm gonna make sure that it gets decertified because I know it's not valid until I've gone through the whole financial close process. Or it might be a report or a dashboard that goes through a process where we just flag it as, hey, analysts, go take a look at this and just make a note to say, yes, it's still good, right? So just a review for recertification without a explicit decertification process that happens. So again, right sizing it to the right asset is the idea. And then, same principle applies with elapsed time, right? And if we think about that additionally, right, in addition to this sort of schedule or event-based model, there are also scenarios where either automated decertification or review for decertification can happen because the content changes. So if I certify a piece of content and then I go in and I change the fundamental logic for how that content is built. I change the whole SQL logic underneath. Well, that's potentially a high risk change. I've changed the business logic. So that might trigger automated decertification, and where then we need to go in and we need to change the definition. What does this mean? We changed the rule for how gross revenue is computed. Let's go and change the business rule definition and go from there and then recertify the content. On the other hand, if it's a low risk change, maybe I've just changed the description of the content, or I've changed some chart, but we haven't really changed the underlying visualization, underlying logic, then that might be more of a description change where I might not automatically decertify, but I do want to flag those changes so that the analyst who's responsible for it realizes for that report and realizes, hey, there's been a change underneath. I need to go and do something to make sure that the documentation reflects. So either auto decertification or let people know about the fact that something needs to be reviewed for whether it's just still be certified based on whether the change is high or low risk is a key thing. So we've given you kind of the framework there. Let's dive in for a moment and look at some very specific examples so you can kind of see how this would work in practice. So imagine for a moment now that you have a network performance visualization, right? This is a dashboard you've created for your network engineers to know whether performance on the network is adequate or whether there's some kind of network bottlenecks that are taking place. So in this example, clearly this has a low business impact because if the user of this if for some reason there's an error in there and it's not showing the right numbers, well, if there's a problem with the network, somebody's going to complain. So there's kind of some fail safes for something going wrong here. It's not ideal, but the impact isn't as high as other things out there. Similarly, there's a small audience, right? So it's only going to be a handful of network engineers that use that content. So for this kind of content, you would put it sort of in the bottom right-hand corner of our grid. You would say, this is a content that you're going to maybe review every 12 months to see if it should be certified. It's going to be a single person is going to be involved. And then it's going to have, it's not going to be automatically decertified. That analyst is just going to get the report to say, it's 12 months have passed since you published this content and certified it. Take a look and let it, either update the date to say, yes, this is still good, or go ahead and decertify if it's no longer relevant. It can be replaced with something else. Another example would be a sales quota attainment report. So kind of what I gave you before. So now you've got something that's going out to the sales reps. In this case, clearly this is more important. It's got a larger distribution. All your sales team is receiving. It has bigger business impact. If you present the wrong numbers there, sales reps might stop believing the numbers, and it could affect their performance. So you would want the business analyst together with the BI analyst together with a business owner working together on that certification process. And for this kind of object, you also probably want a calendar-based recertification process, right? Because your sales rules for commissions, they change every single quarter. At the beginning of the quarter, there's territory realignments. Quotas are reset or adjusted. So in that scenario, then at the beginning, first day of the quarter, that content should automatically get decertified. And then as soon as the analyst and the business owner have worked together and have determined that yes, the new rules are applied, then that content gets recertified, and the sales team knows that they can trust that data. Third example, now let's look at monthly fiscal reports. Let's imagine now you've got this report. This is reporting that your board and your executives are using to be able to determine whether what your numbers are. It's maybe even being used to share numbers externally. That is obviously something that would require three-party certification. The data steward needs to be involved in this, so you make sure that everything is correct, because there's legal liability as well as huge financial liability from getting anything wrong. And this is similarly a piece of content that we would want to say, well, you want to automatically decertify it at the beginning of every calendar month, because once the fiscal month ends, we need to close the books, we need to validate the numbers are right, and only after the entire certification process has been completed for the month can that content be recertified. So these are three examples. You can see how we've really right-sized the number of people that are involved associated with making this happen. Right? So now that we've talked about that, let's talk a little bit more about the process. Right? So in all these cases, if you're going to have content out there that is going to be certified, to publish it, you want to do 5 things in the certification process. You want to first say, what alerts do we need in place? So are there any data quality alerts that should be put in place? In some cases, maybe no, but in many cases, you want to check that the underlying data is correct. There's not been a data pipeline issue or something has changed where it's no longer valid. You also want to add data classification fields. So when somebody's consuming that content, you want to be able to communicate to the person who's looking at it, what's the data sensitivity around this? Is there any PII data? Are there any other things that you need to address from a GDPR or from a data compliance perspective and governance perspective to make sure that you're communicating to the audience that's consuming this data so that they're properly using this data? Right? If it has PII data, I need to make sure I don't interact with it, and otherwise I don't download the data. Maybe I'm not even allowed to download the data, right? Whereas if it's not sensitive, public-facing information, I know I can send that broadly externally. So having that information as part of the certification process is very important. You also want to add documentation, so release notes, usage guides, anything that's going to help the consumer of this content consume it properly, understanding in context. You want to include any kind of business terms or glossaries associated with it. So if a particular visualization references churn, well, we should have the churn definition part of a glossary that gets associated with it. If its gross revenue is in this financial visualization, I should be able to see as the consumer of that content that gross revenue is there, and I should be able to understand what the definition of it. So making that linkage between those business terms that the business analyst and business owner have defined and the visualizations that actually have been built with it is very important before the content is certified, so that information is available to the end consumer. And then with all of that being completed, then we can finally say, yes, now that content should be certified. And who does this? Of course, depends upon whether it's a 1-party, 2-party, or 3-party certification based on the grids that we reviewed with you before. So in the 1-party certification model, then the BI analyst can do all of the above. They can determine, yes, the right quality checks are in place. Yes, I have any classification information has been tagged for this content. I've added the necessary documentation. If there's any glossary of terms I need to associate with this, I've linked it up, and this is certified and ready to go. On the other hand, if this is content that's been deemed for 2-party certification, right, where both the BI analyst and the business owner are involved, then the BI analyst would be involved in the first 3 parts of that process. They would be responsible for making sure that data is high quality is addressed, that the classification fields are associated with it because they know the data, that they've added the necessary documentation. And then the business owner would kind of review all this, and they would tag to the glossary of terms. They'd say, this is, yes, I agree that this is actually mapped to this particular business term, and they would be responsible for giving it the final stamp of approval for certification. So an example I gave you before, maybe the sales ops engineer builds the report, does the first 3 steps, and then the sales ops manager says, yes, this is now, let me tie this to all the key terms around attainment, and it is good to go, I can certify it. And then looking at the most highly governed process, the stuff that requires the most rigorous governance, whereas 3-party governance, there you're looking at a certification process where the data steward's responsible for the data steps. So they're responsible for saying, yes, the adequate quality alerts are in place. Yes, the classification has been denoted for this. The BI analyst vouches for the fact that the right logic has been used there. The business owner says, yes, the logic instantiates the business rules that we've agreed to as an organization, and then gives the final go ahead to say, yes, this can be certified and moves forward. So we've talked about the people that are involved and the roles involved. We've talked about the process, and so let's talk about the final piece of this final cog in the process, and that is the technology, right? So there are three pieces that we need in place to make this work, and Mike is going to show you an example of how to make this happen within Metric Insights, but really you can do this yourself by building your own solutions, or you can use other technologies. The important thing is to recognize that the technology underpinning is required in order to make the process that I just described work with the people that you have on your team. So the first part we're going to look at is the portal. You need to be able to put all these assets together, the assets in a single place, publish them, manage the content, have a way to have it all be in a governed space. Otherwise, you really can't get out the starting gate. So we'll talk about that. Mike will also show you how you can do classification, certification, and publication with the workflow. You need to have whatever those workflows that we've discussed. They have to be able to be instantiated into the technology that you're using, so that you can take users through that process and not make it an odorous process, right? Clearly, if you've got this great process, but if executing it requires a Herculean effort among your stakeholders, they're not going to adapt to it, because there's so many other things that they have to do. So things are just going to fall out of compliance. So it's critical that for the right process, you also have a very simple, easy to follow workflow that people can execute with little friction, so that you can get compliance. And then finally, you need to measure that compliance. So you need to know, how are you doing both from a process perspective. If you've instituted certification and a process flow, are people adhering to that? Is it happening to the extent that should be? Are there people that are not adhering that we need to educate, or to figure out, are there changes in the process or changes in the tools that need to be made in order to better support them? And then how is this translating into overall engagement? Because at the end of the game, at the end of the day, if you've spent a whole bunch of time certifying content, obviously you need to make sure that your users are actually consuming it, and that's happening. So with that, I'm going to transition to Mike, who can show you some examples of how this would work in Metric Insights.
Yeah, thanks, Marius. So let's switch across to Metric Insights here. So as Marius said, I'm going to show you sort of a technical implementation of a lot of these areas that Marius has been talking about. But again, how you implement this is up to you guys, and ultimately it's about having technology in place to be able to do it. I'm going to talk through initially sort of things from an end user perspective as it relates to having a sort of centralized portal where you can manage all these processes, but also where users can consume information and understand the governance aspects of it that you have put in place. So let's start by looking at it from sort of that end user perspective. And then we'll drill into some of the process stuff, the workflows that Marius has been talking about. So what you're looking at here is the Metric Insights portal. And again, what a portal should be able to do is really connect to any source of BI in your organization, any assets that ultimately you want to publish to end users. And so what you're seeing here is our catalog view, where each of these tiles, as we call them, is linked to a particular asset that has been published into the catalog. And again, we'll look at that process in a minute. But as a user, regardless of where that content is coming from, whether it's Tableau or Power BI, or we've got spreadsheets or documents out there, in a single place, I should be able to see that content and access it. And when I do access content, I should be exposed to the governance aspects that are in place that are relevant for that particular piece of content. So in this scenario, if I click on that sales analysis dashboard from Tableau, you'll see what's happening is that, obviously I'm seeing the name and a preview of what that content looks like. That's a preview that's been generated after the content updates each time. But on the right-hand side, you'll also see any context that has been deemed and categorization that's been deemed important for this particular asset. So things like ownership of it. Clearly, this was a 3-person certification that happened on this content. It has a business owner, it has a data steward, it has a technical owner, the analyst who created it. I can obviously see the description and when it last updated, so I've got context around how fresh this report is and how up to date it is. I've got classification for the content, so fields that tell me whether this is something internal to the organization, whether it's sensitive, whether it's publicly admissible information, or whether it contains things like PII data that Marius said. And these are fields that again might dictate, as we'll see in a minute, whether I can do things like download the content or share it with other users. If something does contain PII data, then maybe those functions would be automatically disabled within here. And we'll look at this in a minute, but I can also get access to glossary terms that in this case the business owner has deemed exist within this particular report, and we'll look at that in a sec. But if this is something that is what I'm looking for, so in this case, yeah, I'm interested in looking at this sales analysis and this context has backed that up. If I click into it, then I should be able to access that content as an end user. I've got the live Tableau dashboard in this case with all the context around it. So I can see the names, the descriptions. I can see that for want of a better word, metadata that has been created during the governance process. I can see that the business owner has attached documentation to the dashboard in terms of release notes and definitions that I might want to go and look at. I can even see things like the lineage for this particular piece of content. So where did it come from and where's it being used in terms of things maybe like emails that I might be receiving that contain this content. So in this scenario, not only am I accessing the content, obviously, but I know what it is and how I should be using it. If we go back to these glossary terms as well, you'll see that again the business owner has tagged this particular dashboard in terms of it containing certain business metrics and KPIs and dimensions that have effectively been defined at an organizational level. And if I click on those, I can see things like the definition of those terms, how in this case sales is calculated in this dashboard and what it consists of. And again, these terms may be governed in their own right. So there may be people responsible for creating these definitions, for where the data comes from for these definitions. And so there's accountability. And I know I know I can trust the metrics that I'm looking at in this particular report. So regardless of, again, the underlying technology that you're creating the content in, I have a Power BI dashboard here, the process should be the same. I should be able to get the categorization of the content, the glossary terms, the ownership, everything that's relevant. And if I drill into content, it should be a consistent experience where I can access that stuff and know exactly what it is I'm looking at and how to use it. So we talked a lot about the sort of the governance process. A piece that is also critical when it comes to governance, and we didn't touch on this much in the slides, but it's obviously a piece of the publication of this content, is the security and permissions aspect of it. And you're always trying to balance, I think, security with making people aware of what content is actually out there. And obviously you want to lock down content from a permissions perspective to make sure that users are only accessing things that they should be getting access to. And so I flipped across to another browser window here where I'm logged in as another user, Sam. He's our sales manager in this organization. And obviously when a user accesses a portal like this, you need to make sure that you're persisting that security and those permissions so that a user is coming in and only seeing sort of the categories of content that they have access to, and the actual reports and dashboards that they should be looking at. And obviously that's what we're doing here. When I log in as this user, the categories and folders and tiles that I have access to are the ones that I should be looking at. However, there is always this sort of balance between locking things down, but also making users aware of what is out there. And in a lot of environments, if you purely think about it from a security and permissions perspective and you hide things from people, then it ends up generating a lot of duplicative content. Because if I, for example, as a sales manager, am interested in what's happening, say, in our customer service organization, and I have some questions around some of our metrics there, if I don't know a particular report exists, I might reach out to an analyst and get them to create one for me. That report might already exist somewhere else, and suddenly we've got a copy of something that's out there already and create clutter and overhead in the environment. So what your portal should be able to do is when a piece of content goes through that governance and publication process, is, if appropriate, it should be possible to tag it as what we refer to as discoverable. And as a user, I should be able to see content that's been made discoverable, like this help desk dashboard here, which has a padlock on it indicating, okay, I know it exists, but I actually don't have access to it. The image is blurred out. But if I have questions around our help desk operation, I should be able to request access to that piece of content. And in this case, an email would go out to the owner of this content asking them to give me access if appropriate. So balancing security and discoverability is important to making sure that, again, you're keeping a relevant set of content. You're not wasting time creating duplicative content out there. And obviously within the portal, you then want the ability to obviously allow users to browse through the content, but also search through that. So as you go through this governance process, adding categorization and metadata and certification to the content, as a user, I should be able to come in and search through that catalog based on that categorization. So if I come in and say, show me sales reports, it should go recognize that obviously I'm looking for stuff related to sales. It should be able to search through that categorization and bring me back a ranked set of results that ultimately, fulfill the term that I'm looking for, in this case, sales. And be able to drill into those and again, find what is relevant to me. The last piece of the process that Marius spoke about in the certification process, in the publication process, is this concept of certification as well. And so after a piece of content has had the categorization fields added, the data has been checked and it's been published, someone is typically going to give it that final stamp of approval that says it's certified. And when I'm looking through content, I should be able to filter out by that content that has been certified and see ultimately who did that within that piece of content. So in this case, I can see all the certified sales reports, when they were certified, who's responsible for them, and again, have that level of accountability on the content as I'm looking at it and know that I can trust it. So let's transition and think a little bit about the process itself and the workflows behind this. And certification is where we can start. And typically what happens in a portal environment like ours is when new content gets created, it gets pushed into the portal, into sort of a staging area that based on how you've categorized the content will mean that certain individuals or an individual is responsible for carrying out that process that Marius spoke about within the slides. And so as a user on the platform, I am continually going to be responsible for looking at new content or reviewing content that's in there. And so I should have an easy way of being able to see what content is up for review and what content I'm responsible for and what stage I'm responsible for with that content. And so a simple example might be here, where I'm in as Andrew here, and there's a number of dashboards that have sort of come into my queue where I'm responsible for doing a level of audit and entering classification fields for this content. And from here, I should be able to easily review these dashboards, add in the necessary fields that I'm responsible for, and then ultimately pass it on to the next stage in the process, where maybe it goes off, in this case, to the business owner who's responsible for the final evaluation before it gets that green check mark and stamp of approval. And again, as Marius spoke about, these how this content turns up is it could be new content, or it could be something that has met that trigger in terms of a calendar event or an elapsed time, where again, I'm responsible for reviewing that and deciding its fate within the portal. We also spoke about sort of change events that can trigger the need for certain content to be reviewed or recertified. And so the portal should also support the concept of being able to alert users when those change events happen. So in this scenario, again, if there's content I'm responsible for that's ultimately getting changed, maybe I'm the business owner here, and the analyst has gone out and maybe changed the description or the definition on a particular report or dashboard, I should be alerted to that. I shouldn't have to go and be checking that every day. So I might receive an alert or an email like this with, on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, here's the candidates up for review and recertification. And again, I should be able to click into those, review the changes, and go and either push it back into the certification process or confirm that we're still good and it's still relevant. When we think about the data steward in these scenarios, oftentimes, as well as sort of making sure the analyst is creating the content with the correct data, their sort of responsibility in the review process and in the ongoing process is to make sure that the quality of the data is correct. So if I'm going to publish a dashboard or send it out every week, and before we do that, and before we make it generally available every time, we want to be confident that the data is behind it is accurate, particularly in scenarios like the financial reporting one that Marius mentioned. And so your portal should be able to track data quality issues in an automated fashion. I shouldn't have to go in and manually do that every day. And so in our environment, we're able to check things both from a technical perspective, but you'll see as well, maybe use sort of some of the business metrics as indicators as quality as well. And so a scenario might be if we're publishing those sales dashboards that we've been looking at, they're probably being sourced from our warehouse in this case, where we've got a number of staging tables that are basically serving up the data to those dashboards. And something that we might want to track there is every time those tables get loaded, what's the volume of data going into those tables every day? And oftentimes we sort of get an average number of rows of data going in, and what this metric is tracking in our environment is that number of rows that is getting loaded into each of our tables. And in the metric insights environment, we'll automatically perform some statistical analysis against that volume, and use it as a trigger and an alert if we find unusual values. So in this case, on this particular day, we saw that a significantly less amount of data got loaded into our data set here. And that's probably an indication that something went wrong. Maybe the network went down, or there was an issue with our ETL jobs. And this is probably something that we want to then automatically alert the data steward to, who's responsible for this data, either through email or on their mobile device, whatever makes sense, so that they can really jump in and stop the press if something critical is happening. And if we find these data quality issues, we should also have a way of automatically communicating that to our end users, So that, again, if we've gone through this huge process of saying, yes, this content is governed and you can trust it, the last thing we want to happen is if there's an issue with the data and they look at it and they see that there's issues, they're immediately going to not only lose trust in the content, but also in the processes that we have behind it. So if we find issues with the data, we should automatically put things like announcements in the portal to say, hey, we know there's issues with the data today. Be aware that if you're looking at certain dashboards, the content and the data might not be up to date. Therefore, take it with a pinch of salt at this point. And if it's related to a particular dashboard that you drill into, again, making sure that announcement happens and that the users know what is going on. And we can drive those data quality issues from a sort of IT perspective like this, or possibly we look at the business metrics as well. So if we take a metric out of those dashboards, such as sales by region, again, a dip in sales could be related to a business issue. Sure, we had an unusually low number of sales in a particular region on a particular day, therefore we want to notify the business owner of that. But this also could be an indication of data quality issues that we want to make the data steward aware of. And it's just a fact that the full data set did not get loaded on that day. And so using business and IT metrics, tracking those automatically, alerting the relevant stakeholders of the governance process to those issues can again help sort of get ahead of the game in terms of how we communicate this to the end users who are using it. The final piece I want to talk about is the compliance aspect of this. And as Marius said up front, the governance process is something that we want to make sure is effective, and we want to make sure that people understand it is being effective and it's helping engagement and usage of data across the organization. And there's really a couple of ways you can think about it. One is measuring the process itself, and we'll look at that in a second. And the other is measuring it based on how is the content actually being used that we are putting out there and that we're putting through our governance process. And so any portal should be able to track that engagement with our content, looking at the number of views that it's getting, looking at how users are engaging with it. And so you might have views like this, which over time is showing how many views a particular piece of content is getting, what's increasing in popularity, what's decreasing, what's ultimately going unused in your environment, wherever that content might be being used, if it's being consumed in email or through a portal like this or directly within the underlying tool. And so by looking at these engagement stats by our different categories and data sources and user groups, I start to get an indication of whether, again, the content that we're creating is being used, or if it isn't, whether it's something I should be promoting or tagging better, or maybe it's become obsolete, as we've discovered in our review process. I should be getting rid of it. And I should also understand how that content is being used. So, if I have a dashboard like regional sales here, where I've seen that, we got 59 views in the last 60 days, I need to understand whether that was because on day one, I promoted this and everyone looked at it on day one, but never came in again, or whether there is actual continual engagement with that piece of content over time. And this animation is showing me for that piece of content over the last 30 days, who's been coming in and looking at it often, or who sort of looked at it once and never came back again. And so by understanding those sort of user journeys with the content, I get a good idea about whether what we're creating and how we're categorizing it is actually being effective for our end users. I should also be able to look at sort of usage from a user perspective and a user behavior perspective. So obviously looking at it in terms of, how is an individual user maybe within the system or a group of users interacting with content that they have access to. Again, based on what they have access to, are they looking at it at a frequency that we would expect them to, or are they not accessing that data for some reason? And the reason they might not be accessing it is simply that they might not know it's available, or they might not be finding it when they search for it. And so having the portal be able to track search behavior as well, what search terms are people looking for? Are they successful in terms of getting results that they then access? Or are they running search terms where they're not finding results and they're not clicking on things? And maybe this is something we need to factor into our governance process. We're not tagging it correctly. We're not adding the necessary terms. We may need to revisit that, or maybe it's just content that doesn't exist right now that we want to think about candidates for creation. So measurement of the content as an engagement with that content as an indicator around whether your governance practices are effective is important. And then simply things like measuring the content, the process itself. So for example, if the expectation is that there's a certain amount of content that we're creating that should be certified before it gets pushed to users, how much of that is actually happening versus not? At an analyst or business owner or data steward level, how much of the content they're publishing is going through a governance process versus not, and how are users engaging with that governed content versus the ungoverned content will give you an indication of the effectiveness of the process. And introducing sort of this as scorecards within the organization so individuals know how they're performing as it relates to governance and how they're stacking up against the expectations is a good way of sort of driving compliance to the process itself. So I think we're coming up against time. There's been a few questions I think we've addressed as we go, as we've been through the process and looked at that. As I mentioned up front, the recording will be available shortly on BrightTalk. If there's any questions or you want to look at anything in more detail, you can reach out to us at these email addresses or look at www.metricinsights.com and look out for some invites for some webinars we're going to be doing in the future. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, everyone.